Tonight, we step away from the grand narratives of castles and kings and into the unspoken corners of time. This is not the history painted in glorious portraits, but a testament to the quiet endurance of ordinary people. They were the ones who didn't ride chargers or wear crowns, who faced plagues, hunger, and endless hardships without fame or glory. Their legacy wasn't forged in battle, but in the simple, profound act of surviving, a quiet strength that few could ever comprehend. If the sound of a forgotten world helps you find a moment of calm, please consider liking the video and subscribing. It's always a powerful thing to know who else is out there, drawn into the same quiet stillness. So, let the shadows grow long, find a place of comfort, and let's begin this journey at the edge of the known world.
This village has no official name, or if it ever did, it was lost to the wind a century ago. It rests in a shallow depression of land, a soft crease somewhere in the vague middle of nowhere, just distant enough to avoid roads, records, or any royal attention. You wouldn't find it on a map, even if you possessed such a thing, which you do not. Here, the world ends where the ancient trees begin. The forest is a vast, slow-breathing entity, an ancient presence that seems to only barely tolerate your existence. The fields radiate outward in irregular patches of green and brown, worked until exhaustion, and then worked some more. Somewhere to the north, a great river flows. You have never laid eyes on it, but you have heard it mentioned in the same hushed tones usually reserved for mythical beasts or sacred visions. This is the place where you were born and where you will die, perhaps no more than 60 steps from one to the other. The homes are rough and stooped, as though the wind has leaned against them for too many winters. Their walls are a carefully woven lattice of mud, straw, and sticks, endlessly patched with whatever the weather has not yet claimed. The thatched roofs sag under their own weight, always leaking in places you can't quite reach. The village carries the smells of wet wool, wood smoke, and earth, with a faint, sour hint of livestock and damp rot. None of it surprises you anymore. It is the scent of life itself in this place.
Magical and soothing storyteller tone, soft and melodic, as if reading a fairy tale at bedtime. Use gentle intonation, slow pace, and warm expression, creating a dreamy and enchanting atmosphere that helps the listener drift into sleep. The path leading into the village isn't really a road, just a muddy track where the passage of ox carts has worn 2 grooves deep enough to collect rainwater and swarms of mosquitoes. No important person has traveled it in years, perhaps ever. Most days pass in a quiet rhythm. A distant chime marks the hours from another settlement if the wind carries the sound. But otherwise, you measure time by the sun's position, the depth of the shadows across the fields, or the familiar ache that settles into your back before noon. There are maybe a dozen families here, enough to fill a small gathering on special days. Everyone knows everyone. Everyone knows everyone's troubles, and everyone politely ignores them until it becomes impossible to. The village elder, if you can call him that, is a man named Orin. He once spoke to a traveling sage and now repeats that one conversation as proof of his wisdom. No one questions it. His hut hasn't collapsed, and his goat seems healthy, and that is as close to leadership as anyone requires. Nothing here is precise. There are no written records, no titles, no land surveys. Boundaries are understood simply, past the gnarled old elm or where the ground turns to mud. If a disagreement arises, it is settled with a shrug, a brief argument, and sometimes a loaf of bread passed back and forth until the fight loses its steam. There is no school, no public house, no traveler's lodge. If a stranger arrives, their presence is discussed for weeks. Where did they come from? What do they seek? Are they somehow touched by a strange fate? Do they smell of the sea? The arrival of someone new is both fascinating and mildly unnerving. Magical and soothing storyteller tone, soft and melodic, as if reading a fairy tale at bedtime. You have heard tales of towns, of great cities where buildings stretch 2 or even 3 stories high. But these are stories like those of talking animals or women who become birds. You cannot miss a world you have never truly seen. The forest is too dense, the hills are too long, and the roads, if they even exist, are known more for bandits and misfortune than any promise of a safe arrival. What would you even do? Even if you reached one of those distant places, you don't speak their tongue. You carry no coin. You don't know their customs. You don't even know how old you are. So you stay. There is a profound safety in the familiar, even when it is hard, even when it is dull, even when the roof leaks, the well runs low, and the same thick stew has been in the pot for 3 days. There is comfort in the routine, in knowing where to find firewood, in knowing who to ask when your fence collapses, in knowing which patch of sky tells you when to bring in the sheep. You wake with the light. You sleep when it fades. You work in between. It is not much, but it is life. And in the quiet rhythm of it all, there is a kind of peace. A peace that doesn't demand answers or understanding beyond what is visible from the top of the nearest hill. You might hear whispers of a distant conflict, or the passing of a ruler, or a bright celestial object that terrified a village 5 days' walk from here. But the news never reaches you directly. These are merely echoes, stories passed through too many mouths to carry any true weight. They lose their urgency somewhere between the merchant and the shepherd's cousin. The good harvest, the one when the grain came in thick and heavy. Even old Marjorie smiled for a whole week. His steward came by, as he always did. He collected the grain, asked his questions, and wrote things down on a small scroll. You answered carefully, never with too much detail. He never seemed to like detail. You never the ruler, and you're not entirely sure what he does, but you know his name. You say it when you whisper to the stars, just in case it matters. Because here, on the edge of the world, most things never change. And when they do, it is almost always for the worse. Still, the fire in the hearth glows. The roof mostly holds. The cottage is warm. And tomorrow, the same sun will rise over the same hills. For now, that is enough. In your lifetime, you will walk hundreds of miles, but almost all of them will be in circles. Most people in the countryside never traveled more than a few leagues from where they were born, not because they lacked curiosity or strength, but because the world beyond the next hill didn't truly belong to them. The idea of going to find it felt as impossible as flying. You grew up learning the name of every patch of land between your home and the edge of the field. You knew the shape of every tree stump on the path to the well. You could tell who had walked the road just by the depth of their footprints in the mud. Everything beyond that began to feel theoretical. The next village over might only be 5 miles away, but it may well have been a foreign kingdom. You'd heard stories about it. Who married whom? Who stole a goat? Who said a certain elder snored during a gathering? But you hadn't seen it, and you likely wouldn't, because travel was dangerous. Not in a fun, exciting way, but in the quiet, exhausting, and potentially lethal kind of way. The paths were not well-kept roads, lined with markers and lodges for travelers. They were mostly muddy tracks through dense forests, across open fields, and over long stretches of very empty, very silent land. There were no maps, no directions, only vague advice like, "Go until you see the leaning pine," then left past the stone that looks like a sleeping boar. And on those paths there were many things to fear. First, the forest. The great woods were not scenic parks. They were dense, dark, tangled with roots, and filled with noises you couldn't always identify. Wild boars, predators, and people who didn't want to be found. If you weren't born into the woods, they didn't want you in them. Second, bandits. People with nothing to lose and no land to work. Travelers were vulnerable, especially if they looked even vaguely well-fed. A man walking with purpose might be assumed to have coin. A woman might be traveling alone because she had something worth taking. You learned quickly that confidence was not armor. Third, getting lost. This wasn't a minor inconvenience. If you wandered off the track, no one was coming to find you. You couldn't just follow a river downstream and hope for the best. You could go for days without seeing another soul. Your body could disappear into the thickets like smoke. People wouldn't know you were missing until the next gathering when someone finally asked about you, and someone else just shrugged. Then there were the practical concerns. If you traveled too far, who would tend your field? Who would feed the animals? What if the ruler's steward came by to collect a tax while you were gone? You couldn't explain your absence to a man holding a ledger. Your duties didn't pause just because you were curious about what lay beyond the horizon. And even if you did make it to another village, what then? You weren't expected. You weren't welcomed. Outsiders brought problems, sickness, conflict, strange ideas. You spoke a slightly different dialect, used different phrases, maybe even held your fork differently. You could be met with suspicion or worse. Hospitality wasn't universal. Food was scarce and beds were already full. The safest place was home, not because it was particularly safe, but because it was familiar. You knew which part of the roof leaked, which chickens wandered too far, which neighbor might lend you a tool without asking too many questions. Out there, no one owed you anything. Still, people did travel sometimes. Not peasants usually, but merchants, wanderers, couriers, people with protection or a purpose, or both. You might see them once or twice a year, coming through with carts full of wool or salted fish, trailing stories behind them like campfire smoke. They spoke of cities where buildings were made of stone and shops sold rare spices, where people walked streets that didn't turn to mud every time it rained. It sounded impossible. You listened, but you didn't dream too hard. Because even if it were true, what would you do in a place like that? You couldn't read. You didn't own coin. You wouldn't know what customs were expected. The city could swallow you whole, and no one would even know your name. So you stayed, not because you were afraid, though sometimes you were, but because you had things to tend to, a fence to mend, a young relative to watch over, a bit of grain to dry, and a dozen other tasks that all needed doing before the sun dipped below the tree line. And because, truthfully, you didn't need the world to be bigger than it was. The village was enough. It had its stories and its conflicts, its seasons of hardship and its fleeting moments of joy. It had the familiar rhythm of the days and the quiet pride of surviving another year. Sometimes you dreamed of what lay beyond the woods, but most days you just hoped the stew wouldn't burn while you fetched water. Some people did leave, usually the desperate, the reckless, or the ambitious. A young person might set out in search of work or a cause to believe in. They might come back with a limp or a tail or not at all. And when they didn't return, no one said much. They just shook their heads and said the person went beyond the trees, as if that explained everything. Maybe it did. For those who stayed, life was small, but it was also known. You weren't lonely. You shared your days with family, neighbors, animals, and the land itself. There was comfort in the repetition, comfort in the familiar complaints. You didn't need to see a distant city to understand the value of warmth, or taste a rare spice to know the joy of sweet bread. And as the years wore on, and the aches settled deeper into your joints, and the children grew taller than the fence posts, the idea of travel faded. Not with regret, but with a quiet understanding. Some people were meant to move. You were meant to stay. There is no blueprint here, no architect, no pile of neatly labeled lumber waiting to be assembled. Just mud and wood and whatever else the land hasn't already claimed. Your home isn't a house in the way most people think of one. It's a delicate compromise between shelter and the weather, between effort and decay, between what you needed and what the land reluctantly agreed to give you. You begin with the frame, rough, hand-hewn timbers from the nearest trees, cut with tools that have passed through more hands than you can count. The wood isn't straight. It bends and warps a little, but you don't mind. Neither are your walls. Once the frame is up, you weave thin branches or flexible sticks between the posts, a process called wattle. It's not elegant, but it holds together, much like the rest of your life. Then comes the daub, a mix of mud, straw, and water. You slap it on by hand, pressing it between the gaps, smoothing it just enough to keep the wind out, and pretending it's deliberate. It dries slowly, cracking in the sun, and occasionally falling off in clumps that need to be redone before winter. You grow used to the smell, and eventually you stop noticing it. The roof is thatch, layers of dried straw packed tightly and tied to the beams. When it's new, it's golden, almost pretty. Then the rains come. Then the birds come. Then time comes. The color fades, the edges fray, and holes appear where you never expected them. You start placing buckets in places you hoped you'd never have to. You don't shingle it, you just keep patching it until the whole thing threatens to become more patches than roof. At some point, you wonder if it might be easier to live under a cart. The floor is dirt. You tell yourself it's packed firm, and in a way it is. Years of walking, sweeping, and stomping have turned it into something almost solid. But when it rains, it softens. When it freezes, it cracks. When the animals come in for the night, it's anyone's guess what's actually underfoot. You might spread rushes or straw to cover it. It helps for a while, but soon the straw gets damp, dirty, and walked into dust. Then you sweep it out and start over, or you don't. Eventually, the straw becomes the floor, and you accept it as part of the landscape. The roof is thatch, layers of dried straw packed tightly and tied to the beams. When it's new, it's golden, almost pretty. Then the rains come. Then the birds come. Then time comes. The color fades, the edges fray, and holes appear where you never expected them. You start placing buckets in places you hoped you'd never have to. You don't shingle it, you just keep patching it until the whole thing threatens to become more patches than roof. At some point, you wonder if it might be easier to live under a cart. The floor is dirt. You tell yourself it's packed firm, and in a way it is. Years of walking, sweeping, and stomping have turned it into something almost solid. But when it rains, it softens. When it freezes, it cracks. When the animals come in for the night, it's anyone's guess what's actually underfoot. You might spread rushes or straw to cover it. It helps for a while, but soon the straw gets damp, dirty, and walked into dust. Then you sweep it out and start over. Or you don't. Eventually, the straw becomes the floor, and you accept it as part of the landscape. The windows are technically openings in the wall, covered with wooden shutters that swing awkwardly and never quite close flush. Glass is a luxury, too expensive, too rare, too fragile. So the wind comes in, the cold comes in, the sounds of the animals outside come in, and sometimes the animals themselves. There's a single door, usually hung a little crooked because the frame shifted during the last frost. It latches with a hook or a wooden peg, not for security, but to keep the chickens from wandering out and the wind from wandering in. Inside, the layout is best described as shared. One room, maybe two if someone was able to add a lean-to or a loft, but usually just one, where you sleep, eat, cook, mend, talk, argue, and hope. Everyone lives here. Parents, children, a cousin or two, a grandparent, maybe a neighbor's child whose parents are sick. There's a hearth in the center, built of stone if you're lucky, clay if you're not. The smoke rises through a hole in the roof, more or less. There's no chimney. The air inside is always smoky, a little warm, a little damp, and always carrying the quiet scent of a stew that's been reheated one too many times. Furniture is limited. A table, a bench, maybe a stool, and a chest if someone in your family was unusually good at carving or very lucky in a marriage. Beds are wooden frames stuffed with straw or feathers, often shared and usually squeaking. Blankets are heavy, rough wool and never quite dry. For storage, you use the rafters. Garlic, onions, and herbs hang there. Maybe a small ham if the pig was kind that year. You can smell the difference between early winter and late spring just by the air above your head. Sometimes it's a comfort. Sometimes it's a reminder of how close you are to running out. The animals are part of the household, literally. The cow might sleep in the same room in the corner. Chickens, too. A goat. It isn't ideal, and it isn't sanitary, but it's warm. You learn to tune out the clucks and the shuffles and the occasional startled bleat in the middle of the night. They're part of the background noise, like the wind in the thatch or the slow creak of the walls settling. Nothing is level. The floor dips, the roof slants, and the walls bulge slightly, as if the whole place is breathing in and out with the seasons. You fix what you can. You ignore what you can't. Every spring you swear you'll repair the back wall. Every autumn it's still leaning. It's not a house built to last. It's a house built to get through the next storm. And yet, for all its flaws, and there are many, it is home. You know where the cold comes in and how to block it with an old sack. You know which roof beam you can hang the pot from and which one creaks when someone stands too close. You know how the light falls through the slats in the afternoon and where the dog curls up to sleep. When strangers pass through, they see poverty. You see effort, reuse, and resourcefulness. A roof that hasn't yet collapsed is a victory. A fire that still burns at dawn is a blessing. A dry corner is worth more than gold. And when you lie down at the end of the day, surrounded by snores and silence and smoke and straw, you feel a strange kind of comfort. Not pride exactly, but presence. This is your space. It bends, it leaks, it shifts in the wind, but it's held, and so have you. For the average person in the Middle Ages, food was not an experience. It wasn't colorful or diverse or even all that warm. It was a daily problem that had to be solved again and again, using the same pieces and the same tired hope that something edible might come of it. Your kitchen, if you could call it that, was a corner of your single-room home near the hearth. There was no pantry, no shelves lined with ingredients, just a pot, a fire, and a short list of things you hoped hadn't spoiled. At the center of nearly every meal was pottage, a kind of eternal stew that lived in the pot and never fully stopped cooking. It was never entirely new and never entirely gone. You added to it during the day, you skimmed it at night, and you kept it warm through the seasons. You also whispered a quiet wish that nothing strange would grow in it when your back was turned. The ingredients depended on what you had, which usually wasn't much. On a good day, the pottage might include cabbage, leeks, barley, and a few legumes, perhaps garlic or onions if the harvest had been kind. If it was winter, you used dried beans or peas. If you were especially lucky, a scrap of salted pork might get tossed in. More often, it was just the bone. Even that was valuable. You could boil a single bone for days, hoping it would remember what meat tasted like. The flavor was consistent, earthy, gray, more temperature than taste. You didn't eat pottage for the joy of it. You ate it because it was what you had. A warm meal at the end of the day was more than comfort. It was a small victory. The pot itself never really got clean. It was wiped down, sometimes scraped, but rarely scrubbed. The next batch always absorbed the ghosts of the last one. There were no spices to cover it, no vinegar to brighten it, just a slow, dependable dullness, a taste like boiled history.
Bread was the other major player, not soft or golden or inviting, but hard, dense, and dark. It was usually made from rye, barley, or oats. Wheat, the soft white kind, was for the wealthy. The common people could barely afford to see it, let alone bake with it. The loaves were small and heavy. They didn't rise much, and they crumbled quickly. If you left them out for a day, they could probably double as a weapon. But they filled the stomach and gave you something to soak in your stew. Sometimes the bread was made from questionable grains, husks, or whatever was left at the bottom of the miller's barrel. In hard times, people used bark, not metaphorically. They literally ground up the inner layer of tree bark and mixed it with what little flour they had. The result was hunger bread, bitter, dense, and barely digestible. It kept you alive. On days when even flour was scarce, people used trenchers, slices of old bread used as plates. These soaked up the stew and were either eaten at the end of the meal or thrown to the animals. Sometimes they were passed down the table to someone of lower status, a bread hierarchy at its finest. Protein was very rare. Chickens laid eggs and cows gave milk, but you didn't eat your livestock unless you had no other choice. When you did, you used every part: meat, fat, organs, and bones. The blood was used for puddings, and the fat was rendered. The head might become soup. Nothing was wasted. Pork was the most common meat when it was available. Pigs were efficient, and their salted fat flavored many dishes. often turning something barely edible into something vaguely pleasant. But pigs were slaughtered only when necessary. A whole pig meant weeks of planning, salting, hanging, boiling, and storing.
Fishing was an option if you lived near water, but even that came with restrictions. Many rivers and lakes were controlled by wealthy landowners, and fishing without permission could earn you a fine or worse. When you did fish, it was for eels, small river fish, or anything that wouldn't immediately rot. Salted herring, if you could get it, was a prize. The religious calendar also dictated a fair bit of your diet. On certain days, meat was forbidden, so you pivoted to fish or went without. In more creative times, certain animal tales were classified as fish, a theological workaround that few questioned because it meant having something to eat. Milk was common, but also fragile. You had to use it quickly or turn it into cheese or butter. Butter was a luxury in some homes, used sparingly. Cheese was harder, tangier, and often quite dry. If you had a few good rounds stored away, it meant the cow had been generous that year. Dairy, though useful, didn't always agree with people, and refrigeration didn't exist. Sour milk was used anyway. Butter went rancid, cheese molded. You just cut around the worst bits and hoped your stomach was stronger than the bacteria. Drinks were simple. Water was unreliable and often unsafe to drink, depending on the season and what an upstream neighbor had been careless with. So ale was the default. Weak ale, known as small beer, was brewed in homes and drunk by everyone, including children. It had low alcohol, just enough to kill bacteria and dull the edges of thirst. If you had access to apples or pears, you might make cider. Wine was for the wealthy. Mead was rare. Milk was for the young and the sick. Otherwise, it was ale with breakfast, ale with lunch, and ale to help forget that tomorrow would taste exactly like today.
Vegetables formed the bulk of your diet. Cabbage, onions, garlic, turnips, and leeks. Carrots, though not the orange ones we know now, medieval carrots were white or purple. Most were grown in small gardens, tended carefully, and eaten from root to leaf. Nothing was wasted. The tops of turnips might be boiled into greens, and the skins were composted or tossed into the fire. Fruit was seasonal. Apples mostly, maybe some berries or wild plums. If you dried them, they lasted through winter. Otherwise, they were eaten fast. Preserving was difficult. Sugar was nearly impossible to afford. Honey, if you had bees, was a treasured sweetener. Otherwise, your pottage stayed savory in the loosest sense of the word. Herbs were grown when possible: parsley, sage, dill, mint. They weren't used for flavor so much as for their medicinal or traditional properties. Some herbs were thought to protect against illness, while others kept pests away. Occasionally, they made things taste a little better, but that was a happy accident, not the goal. Meals were eaten together on benches around the fire. There were no courses, no recipes, just a pot, a hunk of bread, and the hope that there would still be something left tomorrow. You didn't complain. Complaining didn't make the stew thicker. If a feast day arrived, for a wedding, a harvest festival, or a special occasion, you might roast a bird or bake a pie. Not the flaky, buttery kind we know today, but a medieval pie that was more like a sealed box of hard dough to hold a meat filling. It might be heavily seasoned if rare spices like pepper, ginger, or cinnamon were available from a good trade. Most days, however, were not feast days. They were quiet. You scraped your bowl, you soaked your bread, you drank your ale, and you leaned back, full enough to get through the evening, if not exactly satisfied. There was comfort in the repetition, in knowing what the pot would taste like, in knowing how much bread was left, in watching the same hands prepare the same meal by the same fire. As the wind whispered through the cracks in the wall and the animals shifted in their sleep, the stew boiled, the bread cooled, and you once again had enough. If you were a medieval commoner, you didn't own much. You might have a patch of land, a few tools, a couple of animals, and a crooked house you built with your own hands, but none of it was technically yours. It all belonged to the Lord. Not a king or a distant mythical figure, but your local landholder, the one who lived in a slightly less crooked house up the hill, with slightly better food and a roof that likely didn't leak. He owned the land, which meant he owned everything on it, including, in a sense, you. You were what was called a serf. This isn't an insult, it's a category. You worked the land, but you didn't own it. You were bound to it. You couldn't leave without permission, nor could you pass it on freely. You owed labor, goods, and deference. You weren't a slave, but you weren't exactly free either. Your relationship with the Lord wasn't built on conversation, it was built on obligation. You didn't speak to him directly. You spoke to the steward, the man who managed his lands and, more importantly, kept track of what everyone owed. And you owed a lot. Let's start with labor. A few days a week, sometimes more during harvest season, you were expected to work the Lord's fields instead of your own. This was called corvée labor. You received nothing for it, no payment, no thanks, just the knowledge that somewhere in the manor house someone was eating a fine meal because of what you had done.
The taxes didn't stop at food. If you used the mill, you paid a fee, even though the mill was the only way to grind your grain, and the Lord owned it and set the price. You might be tempted to grind it by hand, but doing so was often illegal, punishable by a fine or worse, because the Lord didn't just want his share, he wanted control. The same was true of the oven. Many manors had a communal oven that you paid to use. If you tried baking at home and the steward found out, there could be consequences. You learned to do things the official way, even if it took longer, cost more, and made less sense. And then there were the fees. Want to get married? Pay a fee. Want to inherit your father's plot? There's a fee. Want to move to another village? First, ask permission. Then, you guessed it, pay a fee. Your livestock was taxed, your tools were sometimes taxed, and your ability to live your life without permission was often barely untaxed. What did you get in return? In theory, the Lord was supposed to protect you. If bandits attacked or a rival noble invaded, the Lord had men-at-arms who could fight. If a famine struck, He might distribute grain from his stores, though rarely for free. And if you had a legal dispute, say your neighbor's goat wandered into your garden and refused to leave, the Lord's court might settle it. Again, not for free. This was feudalism, a system of obligations and hierarchy wrapped in the language of loyalty and protection. In practice, it was a system of ownership. The land was everything. Those who owned it ruled. Those who worked it obeyed.
The manor itself stood apart from the village, sometimes literally on higher ground. It might be made of stone or timber, larger than any peasant's home, with a roof thatched so thick no wind dared enter. Inside were tapestries, fine tables, servants, and the Lord, of course, wearing wool lined with fur, eating meals you couldn't imagine, and thinking very little about you. He might not know your name, but he knew your numbers, how much barley you owed this year, how many eggs you'd promised, whether your son had reached the age where he could be added to the labor rolls. Everything was recorded, not by you couldn't read, but by the steward, the reeve, the bailiff, men with wax tablets or bits of parchment who came around with questions you learned to answer carefully. And if you didn't meet your obligations, there were punishments, fines, more goods taken, or days added to your labor. In extreme cases, your tools could be confiscated or your land reclaimed. Your house, your animals, your dignity, all of it gone. You didn't resist. Resistance wasn't rebellion, it was foolishness. But here's the strange part. The system worked, not because it was fair, but because it was stable. It had rules, predictable if harsh. You knew what you owed. You knew what was expected. There was no guessing, no sudden surprises, just a steady, grinding rhythm of give, give, give. And occasionally, just occasionally, the Lord would give something back. A feast day where food was distributed. A holiday where labor was waived. A kind word perhaps spoken from horseback. It was never enough to balance the scales, but it was enough to keep things from tipping. The relationship was never friendly, but it was enduring. Your Lord might be young or old, kind or cruel, present or distant, but he was always above. You didn't question that. You bowed when he passed. You removed your cap. You used the right words, not because he deserved it, but because you didn't want trouble. And maybe deep down, because a small part of you still hoped that one day you might be noticed, rewarded, or lifted, even just a little. It almost never happened, but that's how the system stayed alive.
Not just with fear, but with the faintest suggestion of hope. The hope that if you worked hard enough, obeyed long enough, something might change. Meanwhile, the steward kept walking, the reeve kept writing, the mill kept grinding, and you kept digging your hands into the soil year after year, season after season. There was no retirement, no bonus, no upward mobility, only the quiet knowledge that you had fulfilled your role. You had done what was asked. You had made it through another year under the weight of someone else's title. And as long as the Lord was pleased, you were allowed to go on living. long before the great pandemic swept across Europe and etched itself into history. Medieval commoners were already well acquainted with sickness. Not just the kind of illness that came and went with the seasons, but the slow, constant presence of something always waiting to go wrong. Infection, fever, wasting, swelling, coughing. Disease wasn't an event, it was a feature of life. You didn't need a continent-wide catastrophe to be laid low. All it took was a small cut, a single flea, a bit of water that looked clear but wasn't. And unlike weather or taxes, illness didn't follow rules. It arrived without warning, and it rarely left quietly. There were no hospitals, not really. If you were lucky, your village had a wise woman or maybe a midwife, someone who knew which herbs to boil and which ones to burn. If you were extremely lucky, there might be a traveler nearby, well-meaning and slightly more effective than random hope. But for the most part, when you got sick, you stayed home. You lay in bed, you sweated through your clothes, and you just hoped.
Most people didn't understand what caused disease. The idea of germs hadn't been conceived yet. Microscopes were centuries away. What you had were theories, old, confusing, and often wrong. Some believed in bad air that carried sickness through smell. If a village reeked of rot, manure, and smoke, it was assumed to be dangerous, which in a way was correct, but not for the reasons people thought. To combat the bad air, people stuffed herbs into their clothes, carried flowers in their sleeves, or walked around with vinegar-soaked rags pressed to their faces. Not pleasant, not helpful, but deeply believed. Others blamed misfortune. Illness came from bad thoughts, selfish acts, or general moral decay. If your child fell ill, it was a test. If your crops failed, and then your body failed, it was probably your fault, or your neighbor's, or both. There were local traditions, too. Some thought illness came from the evil eye, a glare from someone jealous or angry. Others blamed moon phases, the spirits of animals, or grumpy ancestors. One particularly popular explanation was that sickness entered the body through the soles of the feet. The solution? Boil them. And if that didn't work, burn something nearby, possibly your mattress. The cures were as strange as the causes. If you had a fever, you might be bled. A local man would arrive with a blade, a bowl, and more confidence than training. Sometimes leeches were used, sometimes sharp stones. The idea was to balance your inner humors. No one ever saw these humors, of course, but they were blamed for nearly everything. For swelling, there were plasters, smears of mashed herbs, mud, or even bread wrapped in cloth and tied to the body. Some worked, most didn't, and a few made things worse. But the important thing was that something was being done. If your stomach ached, you might chew on charcoal. If you coughed blood, you might drink wine mixed with crushed pearls. If your eyes blurred, someone might whisper a prayer while blowing smoke over your head. If your leg turned black, you were probably out of options.
And then there were the protective charms. Bits of metal or bone worn around the neck, sometimes inscribed with protective words. Some people buried onions in the corners of their homes. Others hung garlic above the door. One popular remedy was to tie a live chicken to the infected area and hope the illness transferred to the bird. It rarely did, but hope was in short supply, and people clung to whatever they could. Sickness was isolating, but not in the way we think of now. You didn't quarantine. You didn't call for help. You just tried to work until you couldn't. When that moment came, you lay down, and others carried on. Children were fed, animals were fed. You were given broth, maybe, and a few murmured words of support. Sometimes illness passed. The fever broke, the swelling went down. You walked again slowly, with a new limp and a deeper respect for warm soup. Other times it didn't, and your family lit a candle. The word plague, in the broader sense, wasn't always the dramatic kind that left bodies in carts. More often it was a slow infection, skin turning dark, limbs swelling, a cough deep enough to rattle the walls. Smallpox, dysentery, the flu, even a common sickness could sweep through a village and leave half the population in bed. There were no case numbers, no charts, just stories. A traveler from another village said the cough had started there last week, or someone heard that 3 children had died near the river. You paid attention. You started boiling more water. You left herbs under the door. You kept your distance, even if no one said why. Death was not always feared, but it was recognized. People knew when it was near. They knew the signs: breathing that slowed, skin that cooled, eyes that turned dull. There were soft prayers for the dying, whispered by firelight. When the Black Death finally did arrive, it hit with a violence that dwarfed everything before it. But by then, the world was already familiar with sickness. The idea that you could be well in the morning and gone by night was not a new one. It was just happening more often. The plague came in waves, and each time it returned stronger and stranger. Fevers that stole the mind, and blood that darkened and bubbled. People died in days, sometimes in hours. Entire villages vanished. Fields went untilled, and bells rang too often. Some common folk tried to flee, but disease traveled faster than feet. Others turned to a higher power, doubling their prayers and promising to live better if they were spared. A few turned to violence, blaming outsiders, sinners, anyone but the wind. And yet, life continued. People learned how to survive around sickness. They accepted it the way they accepted hunger or cold, not joyfully, but with a kind of tired resilience. They cleaned their homes more often. They shared herbs. They whispered new hopes. Some believed that surviving one sickness gave them protection against the next. Others didn't believe at all, but they got up anyway and milked the cow. Children grew up learning which plants to avoid, which ones to chew, and which ones to boil until they stopped smelling like feet. They knew how to wrap a wound, how to wait out a fever, and how to tell when someone wasn't going to get better. And through it all, they didn't stop living. They married, they harvested, they shared meals such as they were. They sat by the fire and retold stories of the last illness and the time someone's grandfather survived a winter fever with nothing but garlic water and stubbornness. The plague wasn't the end of the world. It was just another part of it. And for those who endured, survival became its own kind of resistance. A quiet, stubborn refusal to go quietly. A belief that tomorrow would come. And if it didn't, someone else would remember your name. Or at least the way you always added rosemary to the broth. Night in the medieval countryside wasn't peaceful. It was silent in the way a cave is silent, full of creaks, distant sounds, and the kind of quiet that makes you notice how loudly your own body exists. The day ended when the light failed, and everything that wasn't already put away had to be dealt with quickly, because once darkness fell, the world shrank to the size of your hearth. There was no artificial light, no candles burning freely into the night. Wax was too valuable. Most nights, the fire dimmed, the coals glowed softly, and that was all. And so you slept, but not in a single unbroken stretch. Sleep in the Middle Ages came in 2 acts, first sleep, then a waking period, and finally a second sleep. This rhythm wasn't accidental. It was how people adapted to the long, lightless hours between dusk and dawn. You would drift into your first sleep not long after nightfall. The fire would be banked. The animals would have quieted. The home, 1 room, maybe 2, would stretch out into stillness. If you had a mattress, it was stuffed with straw or feathers, possibly lumpy and often shared. If you didn't, you slept on woven rushes or directly on the earth, softened only by habit. Everyone slept together. Family, relatives, even servants, all in one shared space, not out of closeness, but out of necessity. It was the only warm room in the house. On the coldest nights, even animals were brought inside. A goat near the door, a dog curled by the hearth, chickens in a basket. Warmth was more important than boundaries. The idea of sleeping alone was associated with punishment, not comfort. The wealthy might afford solitude. Everyone else just made do. You turned to face the wall. You stuffed straw in your ears. You shared blankets. You breathed in each other's breath. And if someone snored, and someone always did, you got used to it.
First sleep lasted a few hours. Then, almost like clockwork, people would wake. It wasn't disturbing, it was expected. During this time, often around midnight, the world was still and quiet. Some people prayed, others stirred the coals, and some used the chamber pot or stepped outside into the freezing air. Some reflected, others whispered. It was a time of dreams, too. People believed this midnight space opened a thin veil between the living and the dead, between the sacred and the mundane.
If you dreamed during this waking interval, you remembered it, and you talked about it the next morning, not in passing, but as something that mattered. Eventually, the second sleep began, deeper and slower. This was the sleep that healed, or tried to. It was when the aches faded slightly, when the day's blisters cooled. If you were lucky, it was uninterrupted. If you weren't, you simply lay still and waited for dawn to give you an excuse to rise. The home didn't go silent at night, not entirely. The fire crackled, wind whispered through the thatch. A baby might fuss, a cow might shuffle its hooves. Sometimes the night was broken by coughing, the wet, rattling kind that never seemed to end, and everyone noticed, but no one said anything. It was understood. The fear of the dark was real and not irrational. The night carried real dangers, both imagined and physical. Wolves, for instance. In some regions, their howls came close enough to the village to raise hairs on the back of your neck. They weren't just creatures of legend, they were real and hungry. Then there were thieves, fires that started from a careless coal, roofs that groaned under snow, and less explainable things.
Sometimes you tied a bit of string around a child's wrist, just in case. Even with protection, some families believed that sleep left you vulnerable, that the soul wandered while the body rested. So people tucked in carefully, covered mirrors, faced the bed toward the fire, and avoided sleeping with their feet pointed toward the door. The cold was its own enemy. It seeped through walls, through thatch, through poorly sealed doors. People didn't sleep under mounds of blankets. They layered wool, fur, cloaks, and tunics. The idea of undressing for bed would have seemed absurd. You slept in your clothes, sometimes in your boots. There was a comfort to sleeping next to others, but also discomfort. Someone always shifted. Someone always murmured. There were elbows, knees, the occasional surprise from the family dog. But this was normal. You didn't expect silence. You expected closeness. And in that closeness, you found a strange kind of security. You heard your father breathe, your child twitch, your grandmother mutter a prayer in her sleep. It wasn't peaceful, but it was human. It was shared. When you dreamed, your dreams mattered. A field of wheat might mean prosperity, a snake, illness, a broken tooth, death. You learned to interpret these things, or you found someone who could. The village had dream readers, not officially, but everyone knew who to ask. The villagers had their own ideas. They warned that some dreams were from the devil, that sleep was a time when temptation could slip in. You were told to pray before bed, to avoid certain thoughts, to keep your soul ready in case the night was your last.
People went to sleep and didn't wake up. Illness could take hold while you rested. A fever could rise. A cough could deepen. And by morning, someone might be gone, quietly as if stolen. This uncertainty
gave every morning a slightly reverent tone. When the light returned and the rooster cried out and the coals were stirred back to life, it meant you'd survived again. You sat up slowly. Every joint reminded you of your age, no matter how young you were. The cold bit your nose. You wiped your face. You looked around and counted bodies. Everyone who stirred was accounted for. Everyone who didn't was checked on. And then, once the living were confirmed, the day began. Water was fetched, bread was prepared, animals were fed. The dream you had, if it was important, was shared. And the memory of the night faded, not erased, just softened, folded into the next stretch of time. In winter, sleep came early and stayed late. In summer, it shortened, but the rhythm remained. First sleep, a waking hour, second sleep. A world without clocks, but not without routine. And for all its discomfort, there was something grounding in that rhythm, something honest. You didn't aim for comfort, you aimed for endurance. And if you happened to find rest along the way, a moment of warmth, a particularly quiet night, a dream that didn't leave you afraid, that was a gift, one you didn't question, one you didn't expect to gain too soon. Some years you're simply hungry. Other years you're in a famine. It's not the same. Hunger is manageable. It has rules. You stretch food, you ration, you hope. But famine breaks the rules. It's when the fields fail, the root cellar is bare, and there's no more pretending that next week will be better. It's when food becomes an idea more than a substance. In a medieval village, you often saw it coming. It started in the spring. Too much rain or none. The barley came up patchy. The beans flowered, then browned. The cabbages cracked open too early. The wheat heads stayed stunted, bowed, as if they were already mourning something. You noticed. Everyone did. At first, no one said it, but the looks were exchanged. The calculations were made quietly. How much is left from last year? How much seed can we keep? How much can we afford to eat? The answers were never good. The hardest part was knowing what to do next, not in winter, but in summer. Because that's when you had to choose between planting the seeds or grinding them into flour, between saving for a harvest that might never come, or feeding your child one more bowl of something warm. And so the portions began to shrink. The stew got thinner. The bread got smaller. The bowls didn't come back empty. They just came back less often. You didn't panic, not yet. You told yourself this happened once before, or that another village might have extra, or that the manor stores could fill in the gaps. Hope was still on the table, just not much else. By August, it became harder to ignore. By September, it became impossible. You stopped feeding the animals first. Chickens were quiet. The goat's bleating grew hollow. The dog, if you had one, stopped barking and started following you more closely, as if it understood
it was next. Bread became a ritual. One loaf split 5 ways. Everyone chewed slower. No one commented on the crust. Even the smallest crumb was swept up with reverence. The stew was now mostly water. If it had color, it was from the pot. You boiled weeds. You ground roots. You pulled up things you didn't recognize and hoped they weren't poisonous. Some weren't. You didn't sleep through the night, not because you were afraid, but because your stomach reminded you every few hours that it was still empty. The children asked fewer questions. That's how you knew it was real. By August, it became harder to ignore. By September, it became impossible. You stopped feeding the animals first. Chickens were quiet. The goat's bleating grew hollow. The dog, if you had one, stopped barking and started following you more closely, as if it understood it was next. Bread became a ritual. One loaf split 5 ways. Everyone chewed slower. No one commented on the crust. Even the smallest crumb was swept up with reverence. The stew was now mostly water. If it had color, it was from the pot. You boiled weeds. You ground roots. You pulled up things you didn't recognize and hoped they weren't poisonous. Some weren't. You didn't sleep through the night, not because you were afraid, but because your stomach reminded you every few hours that it was still empty. The children asked fewer questions. That's how you knew it was real.
They didn't ask when the bread was coming. They didn't ask for honey. They didn't beg for stories. They sat close to the fire and stared. They learned how to wait. And your neighbors, you stopped seeing them outside. The village quieted. No more laughter in the lane. No more arguments about sheep. Just the occasional cough or the crack of firewood. Famine didn't make people cruel. It made them silent. Sometimes someone would bring back a rabbit or a bird or a handful of acorns that could be soaked and ground. You chewed them even when they still tasted bitter. You smiled anyway, not because it tasted good, but because it was something. You tried not to resent the manner. Sometimes they gave grain, sometimes they didn't. The steward came around less. That was both good and bad. Good because he wasn't there to take anything. Bad because he wasn't there to help either. His silence said more than words ever could. The church did what it could. Bread after a service, charity for the poorest. But they too were stretched thin. You held your prayers more, not out of faith, but out of repetition. Words are easy when your hands are too tired to do anything else. Some left the village entirely, packed up and wandered to find work or food or a new life. Some returned, some didn't. You never asked what happened. You were too tired. The body changes in a famine. You feel your ribs first, not from the outside, but from within, like they're too close to your skin. You stand up slower.
You bruise easier. You wake up with your hands clenched like they're still gripping tools you can't afford to use anymore. And the cold hurts more. The fire is your best friend. You spend more time tending it than you ever did cooking on it. You sit close. You sleep facing it. You feed it even as your belly goes empty, because heat is the one luxury you can still provide. By now you've eaten everything that could be eaten. The roots, the weeds, the dried beans, the stale flour. You've boiled bones 3 times over. You've soaked bark. You've baked hunger bread that cracked your teeth. And when the food was gone, you looked to the things that weren't food, but might become food in the right light. Leather, boiled and salted. Not delicious, not satisfying, but technically chewable. You found a rat once. You didn't scream. You gave thanks. Then you hid it, cooked it alone, and told no one. You still feel a faint guilt, but you don't regret it. The dreams become strange. You dream of feasts, tables full of roast and bread and fine drinks. You wake up chewing your tongue. You dream of boiling things over and over, even though you haven't boiled anything in 3 days. You dream of animals coming back, of green shoots breaking through snow. You dream of your childhood when hunger was simpler. And some nights you dream of being full. You wake from those, crying.
The graveyard grew slowly at first, then quickly, then too quickly to keep up. You knew someone had died when the church bell didn't ring. It meant there weren't enough hands to lift the rope. The grave was shallow, the prayer was short, the mourning was silent. Everyone had their own hunger to manage. You wanted to grieve, but you couldn't afford the emotion. You held it back like everything else. Then, like every famine, it ended, not suddenly, but steadily. Rain came, and it stayed. The ground softened, seeds germinated, plants reached up, weak but real. You had enough energy to hope again. You saved the first harvest for others, children first, elders next. You took the smallest bowl. You smiled as you passed it, and when the first good loaf came out of the oven, cracked on top, dark on the bottom, you stared at it before you ate. You remembered every day you went without, every trick you used, every lie you told to spare someone else. You ate slowly, and this time it filled you. By the time you could walk, the church had already marked you. It had taken your name at baptism, blessed your breath with a language you'd never understand, and stitched your soul into a system that extended far beyond your village. You belonged to the church not because you chose to, but because there wasn't another option. In the quiet corners of your life, those dim early mornings before the fire had caught, those wet nights when the wind howled through the shutters, you felt its presence like gravity. It didn't just exist beside your life. It organized it, judged it, taxed it, forgave it, and defined it.
The church wasn't a place you visited. It was the air around you, the road beneath your feet, the rhythm of your year. It was the voice that murmured over your grave and the one that whispered about it decades before you got there.
The village priest, often the only person who could read, was not just your confessor. He was also your calendar, your counselor, and the nearest thing to a seer you had. He held the mysteries of the sky and the stories of the saints, and knew why a pig might die or a storm might come. He walked through the village like a man carrying both blessing and threat in his robes. You brought your sins to him in whispers, hoping he wouldn't look disappointed. You tried not to think about what he knew. You saw him at birth, marriage, and death, the only guaranteed ceremonies of a peasant's life. And in between, he spoke for a presence you feared more than you loved, because love, you were told, required obedience. A different language was spoken at the center of the town, and it might as well have been a spell. You stood in the gathering hall beside your family, feet numbed from the cold, listening to words that never belonged to you. You didn't know what the elder said as he lifted the bread, but you believed, or tried to, that something invisible had happened, that the bread wasn't bread, that the ale wasn't ale, that the murmuring of words and gestures could move the divine. You didn't speak the words, but they moved through you anyway. You mouthed along where you could. You crossed yourself when the others did. You learned the rhythm of holiness, like someone learns the path to a well without understanding every step, only that you needed it.
The church told you when to fast and when to feast. It carved the year into sacred pieces. You didn't say March or April. You said after the spring planting or near the festival. It told you what you could eat, when you could eat it, and how you should feel about enjoying it. 40 days without meat before the spring holidays, followed by a feast so rich it made you dizzy. Special fish on certain days, even if you lived nowhere near water. For the wealthy, this meant fine almond milk, but for everyone else, it meant turnips and cold broth. On feast days, you shared what you could. On fast days, you imagined what you couldn't. But even when your bowl was empty, your plate was full of rules. Your calendar wasn't just for prayer, it was also for payment. The church collected 1/10 of your yield, no matter the season. Grain, eggs, wool, chickens, cider. If it came from your field or your body, it had a price. You gave because it was the portion. That's what you were told. But the portion wasn't collected by a distant being. The elder did, or the steward with his ledgers and his silent nods. You watched your best barley carted off to the tithe barn, which was always bigger than your home. You saw your neighbors hand over their last sack of oats while the elder prayed for a mercy they had just paid for. And when the harvest failed, when the rains came too late or the frost too early, the demand didn't change. You owed what you owed. Sometimes they let you pay in candles or labor. Sometimes they didn't. Sometimes the debt grew so heavy it bent your back even when you stood upright. But the church didn't just take. It gave too, though not always in the way you wanted. It gave stories. It gave structure. It gave reasons. When your cow died without cause, the elder told you which figures to pray to. When your child fell ill, he told you it might be a test or a punishment, or the devil slipping in through a crack in your belief. He offered blessings, told you to light a candle or visit a shrine.
Sometimes he gave you a scrap of a relic, an old bone, a tooth, a ribbon from some forgotten legend. You held it like a treasure. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. But even when it didn't, it was better than nothing. There were figures for everything, for teeth, for plowing, for illness. You didn't know where they were buried or when they lived. You only knew their names and what they could fix. Their stories were half memory, half magic, told in flickering firelight by people who weren't sure where truth ended and legend began. You called on them when you had nothing else. You whispered their names as you stirred the pot or knelt in the field. You made deals with them, promised bread or fasting or a pilgrimage if only they would help you this once. Sometimes they did, or seemed to, and that was enough to ask again.
Pilgrimage was a holy journey, but also a way to leave. For a few days you stepped outside the same 5 leagues you'd lived your entire life. You walked roads you didn't know, toward shrines you'd only heard of. You carried your prayers with you, strapped to your back, clutched in your hands. You slept under hedges or in the corners of barns. You arrived footsore and raw, stood before a bone or a statue, and hoped something would shift inside you. Sometimes it did. You returned not healed, but changed, or at least tired enough to believe you had been. Even death was a ritual choreographed by the church. When you felt it near, you sent for the elder. He came with oil and words. He touched your forehead, prayed over your body, tried to ease your soul into what came next. Your family gathered. The candles were lit. The bell might ring if someone had the strength. You were buried on sacred ground beside others who had walked the same path. And then came the masses. Your family lit more candles, paid for prayers, hoped the elder remembered your name in his chants, because even in death there were deaths. The church taught that your soul might not go straight to a place of peace. It might linger in a shadowed hallway between suffering and salvation. You could wait there for years or centuries unless someone helped, unless someone prayed, paid, lit enough candles, and said your name often enough to pull you through. And so your family paid what they could. The poor gave bread, the rich gave land, all to shorten a stay in a place no one had seen, but everyone feared.
Because fear, too, was part of the church's gift. The church explained the world when no one else could. It told you why the rains failed, why your child didn't wake, why illness took the young and spared the cruel. It told you that suffering had purpose, that obedience had reward. It gave you structure in the middle of chaos, and that structure, even when it burdened you, gave you peace. Not comfort always, but peace. You never questioned the church's power, not seriously, not out loud. You might grumble about the tithe or curse when the elder looked the other way, but you never stopped showing up. You didn't stop kneeling. You didn't stop crossing yourself when the bell rang. Because if the church wasn't right, then the world had no shape at all. And a world with no shape was a terrifying thing. Even when the elder drank too much, even when the leader demanded too many taxes,
Even when a person selling promises passed through town with a cart full of hopeful words and a purse full of coins, you still believed, or you acted like you did, which in the end was mostly the same, because belief was less about what you thought than what you did. You didn't understand the words, but you understood the structure. You stayed inside it because it was the only way forward. And when you died, you hoped the bells would ring and the candles would burn, and your name would be said often enough to matter. You hoped the figures still listened. You hoped your sins had been counted and forgiven in equal measure. You hoped the church, in all its weight and mystery and dust and gold, would carry you the rest of the way.
You might think that after everything they endured, after the famines and plagues, after the tithes and taxes, and the heavy hand of the manor's authority, commoners would have risen up more often, that the weight of centuries of suffering would have built up until it cracked the walls of their villages, until one cold morning the frost would thaw and something inside them would snap. You might think they would have gathered in fields and marketplaces, tools in hand and fire in their hearts, shouting that they would kneel no longer. But they didn't, not often, not for long, and never all at once. There were revolts, yes, a rebellion in one land and another in a different place a few decades earlier. Small uprisings scattered across Europe like stones thrown into a still pond. Angry voices in places where the lords had taken too much, pushed too hard, taxed one coin too many. Sometimes the spark caught. A tax collector's house burned. A steward was run out of town. A banner was lifted. But those fires burned fast and were snuffed out even faster. They ended in public executions in the town square and a silence heavier than the one that came before. The world didn't change. The grain still had to be sown. To understand why commoners didn't revolt more, you have to stop thinking of them as naive or cowardly. They weren't. They were survivors, not of single tragedies, but of unbroken hardship sustained year after year. They lived in a world of low ceilings, where hope was something rationed like grain. They didn't lack courage, they lacked margin. In a life where every day was spent just trying to keep the roof patched and the soup warm, there was no space left for rebellion. You could plan a revolt, or you could dig potatoes. You couldn't do both. The truth was, the system worked, not because it was just or kind or efficient, but because it was ancient. It had sunk its roots into the habits of generations. It didn't need to be explained. It simply was.
You owed labor. You owed grain. You owed the church its tenth and the Lord his harvest. You owed a quiet nod when the reeve passed your door. You were born into that debt. And unless you were exceptionally lucky, you died in it too. But by staying within those bounds, you could survive. Barely, yes, but you could. The cost of stepping outside those rules was too high. The manor had soldiers. The church had its punishment. The ruler had no idea you existed, but he had laws that still bound you like rope. The penalty for defiance wasn't always death. Sometimes it was worse. Banishment, starvation. your family left to carry the debt you tried to escape. Everyone had heard a story. A father taken, a mother punished, a cousin who disappeared after refusing to pay. The stories were passed down not to stir rebellion, but to prevent it. Besides, rebellion often didn't feel like an option, because the people you lived beside were not strangers. They were your kin, your neighbors. You shared fields, tools, fences, and prayers. Even if you resented the tithe, you still brought bread to the gathering. The village wasn't a place you could leave easily, nor was it one you could tear apart without tearing yourself apart in the process. To revolt against the manor was, in some small way, to revolt against the rhythms of your own life. It's easy centuries later to imagine the commoner as a figure of eternal submission, head bowed, hat in hand. But this picture misses the complexity of their world. Submission wasn't servitude, it was negotiation. Most people did not simply suffer. They adapted. They bartered. They bent. They found cracks in the walls and made homes in the spaces between the rules. A pig kept off the ledger. An extra sack of rye buried in the earth. A bribe given in eggs rather than coin. These were the rebellions they could afford.
They were practical people. Their world was not governed by ideology, but by weather. The question was not, what is just, but, will this feed us through winter? And justice, if it ever came, was a luxury they didn't trust. Lords changed, elders were replaced, rules shifted, but the wind still blew. The soil still needed turning, and children still cried from hunger. You didn't revolt against that. You endured it. The church played its part too, and perhaps more effectively than the sword. It taught that suffering was holy, that endurance was righteous, that the meek would inherit the earth, though it never said when. You were taught that your trials were not punishment, but purification, that your obedience would be rewarded, not in this life, but in the next. And if the promise of a peaceful afterlife wasn't enough, the threat of an endless, hellish torment filled in the rest, all waiting for the proud, the rebellious, the ones who said no. And yet the commoners were not passive. Their resistance was just quieter. They gossiped about the stewards. They sang rude songs about the Lord's habits. They laughed when the elder stumbled on a sermon. They told stories at night of better days and better men. They found dignity in the smallest acts, a shared crust, a well-timed silence, a field tended just a little differently than the rule-book said. Their rebellion was in the way they survived despite it all, not because they accepted the system, but because they made it bend just enough to let them breathe. Sometimes, of course, things changed. A lord died, and his son was kinder. A new religious leader forgave debts. A terrible storm reminded the powerful that even they were mortal. But those changes came from above. The commoner's job was to wait, to endure, to hand down what little they had, and to teach their children to be quiet when they had to be, and brave when they could be.
And there were dreams. Of course there were.
You might not have called it revolution, but you thought of a different life. You dreamed of a day when your child wouldn't have to carry the same burdens, when no one would knock on your door with a list of debts, when your back wouldn't ache before age 30, when you could sleep without worrying about wolves or soldiers or winter. Those dreams kept you going, but they lived beside reality. You didn't expect them to come true. You just needed them to stay alive. What's perhaps most astonishing is not that commoners revolted so rarely, but that they managed to keep their culture, their beliefs, and their families intact despite the weight of the system pressing down on them. They kept songs alive that no one wrote down. They passed stories from one hearth to the next. They remembered which plants healed and which ones didn't. They taught one another how to give thanks, how to birth children, how to bury the dead. They created a continuity that outlasted kings and conquests. And they did it not with banners or battles, but with persistence.
Persistence was their rebellion. When the manor demanded too much, they survived anyway. When the church taxed their sins, they still lit candles. When the world turned against them, they huddled close and waited for spring. The fields may have belonged to someone else, but the soil still remembered their hands. Revolution didn't live in them the way it would in later centuries, in the speeches of radicals or the slogans of crowds. But there was a different kind of strength in the way they endured. To live a life of hardship without letting it harden you completely was its own kind of defiance. To kneel, not because you were weak, but because you knew you could rise again tomorrow. That, too, was a form of resistance. And so they endured quietly, without monuments or songs written in their names. They endured in the rhythm of the plow, in the smoke rising from cottages at dusk, in the lullabies sung beside dying fires. They endured in stories whispered to children who would grow up and tell them again. History often forgets them or folds them into a footnote beneath kings and conquests. But the commoners were the thread that held the tapestry together. Without them, there would have been no harvests, no great buildings, no armies to march under banners. They built the world, even as they were kept from owning it. They may not have overturned their lords, but they outlasted them. And maybe that is revolution enough.